cradle of civilization. Along with this, the soil is some of the most fertile in the world. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates River, which really helped to kind of jumpstart civilizations that have been sprouting from this area. This area also consistently provided for many different people groups, and most other civilizations sprouted from this area. It will also become important because it connects the Indian Ocean to Europe, and now is giving a presence of oil into the world and the global economy. So a little bit of history. The Babylonian cities are from this area, and so they were a really great empire that held a lot of power in ancient history. The Sumerians stayed there and continued to influence the people around them, and that's where it gave rise to Egypt and India nearby at the same time. With that, the Babylonian Empire was one of the most powerful in the known world, even more powerful than the Greek and the Romans at the time. Ruled by King Nebuchadnezzar, as you might have heard of from, from the Old Testament. Also, he's mentioned and made way to the Medo-Persian Empire, where we'll talk about the Persians and their reign kind of in the world. So just a little bit of fill-in information. The Persians came in from Iran and conquered Babylon. And so that's kind of where they came from, and then Cyrus took over. And then from there, Alexander the Great, as many of you have probably heard of, he came in around 330. Does anyone know Alexander the Great, how big his empire spanned? Do you know from where it spanned the whole area? Okay, well, it was just mostly straight across the Western world from the Middle East clear into Europe. So then the Romans came in and took power. And right after the fall of the Romans, it became kind of ghostly, and there wasn't a whole lot going on there, just small villages and different things like that in the area of Iraq. So this made way for the coming of Islam, which you'll see an increasing importance from this point on also in the history. So Karbala was the city where Shia Islam originally came from. It was the birthplace of Shia Islam. The Battle of the 7th century there was a dispute over the succession to the Prophet Muhammad, which kind of creates a division between the Shia and the Sunni branches of Islam, which we're going to talk more about through the presentation. And so you can kind of see up here, the Shia followers were followers of Ali, who was Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, and the Sunni were followers of Abu Bakr, the father of Muhammad's wife, and successor of Muhammad as well. And so that kind of just divided, and that division is still present in the world today. So with that, they kind of was founded and then began to expand. So this is kind of where Baghdad, the capital, starts to get a lot of attention. It was a big center for trade and just lots of traffic through there. There was expansion efforts that later contributed to the Crusades, and so with that, the Muslims were moving into North Africa, Israel, Europe, and just most of the known world, just kind of trying to expand and bring more into that. They still remained in power in much of the Middle East, despite the stunted expansion. But at this time period, it made way for the Ottomans to come in, and so now we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire. So I realize this is a lot of history we're just trying to. So this was kind of all in that film that we watched also. So the Ottoman Empire ruled from the 16th century to the 20th, and it was run by the Turks. And so, as many of you probably know, the Turks were a far more militant group than many of the Muslim nations at this time. So they were a little bit more aggressive. And the British were really not fans of the Ottomans at this time either. So they were kind of fed up with the Ottomans taking power of their known world. Which kind of led to the British invasion in 1914, which later led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, primarily in Iraq, for our purposes today. And so this makes way for the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is kind of one of the most pivotal, and influential points in moving forward in Iraqi history that we're going to talk about. So in 1916, it was forged from an Anglo-Saxon alliance. And this is what kind of the film focused on a lot, but just to give some more information on, this was when the British and the French, they referred to as drew lines in the sand. And so they kind of just took this area that they got from the Ottomans and divided it, what would be French and what would be British. And so Syria and Lebanon went to the French, Iraq and Jordan went to the British, and the British installed a pro-British monarch to rule. And so basically the rest of the information up there, British kind of said like, yeah, Iraq, you are like your own little nation, but they installed the monarchs and stuff so that they really were still maintaining control. And you see that in much of the British colonies. They continue to do that throughout history. So that's interesting. Move to the next one. And so this makes way to the Ba'ath Party shortly after that. So basically the Sykes-Picot Agreement came and the British were in rule, and then the British monarchs were killed, and so this made way to the Ba'ath Party, which we're going to focus on quite a bit today. Basically this is where unity, liberty, and socialism was one of their big objective. They wanted freedom from anyone outside of the Arab world. And kind of the big thing to focus on with this is they wanted freedom like in all senses. So they wanted freedom from control and freedom from interference. Like kind of just wanted to be left alone from all those outside of the Arab world. The Ba'ath Party established in many countries, but only held power primarily in Iraq and Syria. And there was a spin-off party that controlled Iraq, but it was still the same objectives as like the main Ba'ath Party. And in 1963, they officially took and seized power in Iraq. And so that makes way to Saddam Hussein, who many of you probably know or have heard quite a bit about. And so just to talk a minute about him and his reign, he was the 5th president of Iraq. He was the ruler from 1979 to 2003. He was a leading member of the Ba'ath Party and kind of spun off from the Ba'ath Party and took control. And so he still embodied much of those ideals, but wasn't necessarily representing like the Ba'ath Party as a whole. He maintained control between the armed forces and the government, and so basically what this means is that he just had a really good hold on Iraq and everything that meant. And so he also, in the 1970s, nationalized oil, which later we're going to talk about the GDP, and so that will kind of come into play just with the nationalization of oil and the effect that had on Iraq's economy. And he filled the positions of power with Sunnis, which at the time was less than 1/5 of the population. And then kind of what happened from there is the U.S. and British encouraged the Sunni or the Shia overthrow of Saddam post-Gulf War in 1991. And so the Shias wanted to overthrow him, and the U.S. and Britain were like, yep, that sounds great. And so then he kind of didn't really like that, so he suppressed this rebellion pretty brutally and intensely. And so that's where we see like a lot of the rise in civilian deaths and different things like that we're going to look at later. And so at this time, Shia rule was a majority for the first time, really in a long time. So that's kind of a good point in history. And moving forward into today, there's still continuous conflict. There's an article title called "The Shia Are in Power but Not in Control." And kind of what that means is the Shia are technically in power but not really in control because the Sunnis and the Kurds and even other parts of the Shias don't exactly respect or obey their authority or think that they should be in power. And so there's kind of that internal conflict right now today in Iraq. So today it's volatile. The Sunni insurgents are beginning to establish strongholds, particularly in the Anbar province. They're beginning to move into central and northern Iraq, which is kind of just threatens the unity of the state. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this more in depth throughout the presentation, but the dispute with Kurdistan reign over Kirkuk is threatening the hold of the central government also. So that's kind of where we're at today. The Saddam went out, and we're kind of entering this period of the Shia control, or Shia power, but not necessarily in control, and just the instability of the state of Iraq. So.
All right, a little breakdown of the basics. The size of Iraq is up there, I'm not going to say the number for you, but it's approximately the same size as California, just to give you a comparison tool. It has a large population, and broken down, you can see that it's 75 to 80% Arab, 15 to 20% Kurd, and the other 5% are regional majorities, and those numbers go up and down every single year. That's why it's a ballpark. Religion is a huge part of Iraq and a lot of other Arab nations. Islam is the national religion of Iraq. Most of the civilians or people there adhere to that, 97%. However, like we talked about, there's a split between that, between the Shia and the Sunni. 60 to 65% of them are Shia, and 32 to 30%, or 37% of them are Sunni.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the government structure, and this is going to be kind of interesting because I have to split it up into 3 different sections. So the first section will be how the government is supposed to work. So this is kind of the previous system that was put in place. And then I'm going to talk about the current situation, which is the problem with ISIS and taking control over a lot of Iraq and its oil companies. And then we'll move on to what they're planning for the future. So there's going to be a new government that's put in place, and so that's kind of what they're working on currently. So here is how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be a parliamentary democracy, and can anyone tell me what this was influenced by? Like, which country influenced this type?
Great Britain.
Yep, good job. So here, this is just to give you a visual of all the 3 sections of the government. So we have the executive powers over there, the judicial branch, and the legislative power. And I would like to point out specifically that the legislative power, or the Council of Representatives, is what Parliament is considered in this system. So we can move on. This government is unicameral, which is that similar to the United States? No. They have a proportional representation system. So this means that if 30% of the electorate support for a political party, if 30% of the support is from a certain political party, then that means they will receive 30% of the seats in Parliament. So that's definitely different from the American system as well. And as I said earlier, this was heavily influenced by the British parliamentary system, but it still has a few differences here and there. There are 328 members of parliament, and only 8 are reserved for minorities. So yes, they do have representation, but we can see that it is a very small portion of representation. So the current president, this is a picture of him. He was elected in July of 2014, so that was really recent, and his name is Salim al-Jabordi. I hope I'm not totally butchering these. And then below that, we can see a picture of the prime minister, which is Haider al-Abadi. And it's important to note that he is Shia, and so that kind of goes back to like the Shia versus Sunni conflict. So here, I'm going to specifically dive into the executive branch, and this is the two out of the 3 parts of this branch. So the prime minister is the chief of state, so he has direct executive authority. He's the commander-in-chief, which means he has power over the army, and he is elected by parliament, but through that, he is nominated by the president. So there's kind of 2 voting areas there. And he appoints the Council of Ministers, which is over here. And they act as like the cabinet and government. And they're all appointed by the prime minister. And so within this council, there is 1 prime minister, 3 deputy prime ministers, and 30 cabinet ministers. So there's kind of this checks and balances thing going on. So when the prime minister elects all of these ministers, he's kind of watching over them while they watch over him. And so it kind of creates this circular sort of system. And the president of Iraq, he belongs to the presidency council with up to 3 vice presidents. So it's kind of similar to the council of ministers that we talked about before with like the checks and balances there. What he does is he protects the Constitution, but mainly he serves as the representative of sovereignty and the unity of the state, which is actually very similar to Japan's emperor and the Queen of Britain. However, Iraq's president, he actually has some power, whereas those other 2 figures don't have as much power. And the president is elected by parliament. So the legislative branch, there's only one part of this, and that is the Council of Representatives. They serve a 4-year term, and as I said earlier, there are 328 members. A quarter of the members must be female, and I calculated that this is around 81. And this is actually really interesting because they have more female representation than the US. And so, does anyone have any idea as to why that might be? There's no right or wrong answer.
Well, the US doesn't require a certain percentage of women.
That's true. Yeah, that is definitely a huge factor. Any other comments?
Does it have something to do with like Islam and like the religion in the country? Like that like women are something?
I'm
No?
unsure.
Okay.
But
I mean,
yeah, that definitely could be
Okay.
a factor as well. And if you guys have anything to put on that, that's fine.
You want it?
Um,
Thanks, Mason.
Okay, so, and their job is to enact federal laws and like monitor the executive branch as well as elect the president. So this is the judicial branch. Judicial appointments, which means these are like the judge elections. They are set by laws that are enacted by the Council of Representatives. And there are 3 main courts. There are definitely more than this, but I thought that these were the most important. So there's the Higher Judicial Council, which supervises the affairs of the federal judiciary. And when I refer to that, I mean it's the collection of all 3 of these courts. So that means that this is the highest court out of all 3. And so I'd like to note that this list of the courts is in order from like most power to least power. So we next have the Federal Supreme Court, which is more of domestic government disputes and constitutional issues, which is kind of interesting because you would think that the highest court would deal with the constitutional issues, but that's not.
Madison, the Judicial Council, I have to say that. The Judicial Council does not rule on anything. It just supervises the judiciary. So it is not a court. It's just a council that helps like maintain independence and stuff. So it is not a court. The highest court is the Federal Supreme Court.
Okay. And then the Court of Cassation is the highest court of appeals. So the appellate courts are what appeal to this court. Okay, and this is the current situation today. So they're having conflicts with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which is an anti-government rebel group that has they've taken over a lot of like, what was it? They've taken over multiple oil fields, which I'll talk about in just a second. But they're rebelling against a Shia-led government, which also ties back to like the Shia versus Sunnis, and they just feel very like unrepresented, and so that's why this is coming into play. ISIS wants to establish a caliphate. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Which by definition is an Islamic state led by a supreme religious and political leader. And this is influenced by the expansionist Islamist ideology, which is kind of like it sounds. The whole point is to spread the idea of Islam, and in this case, through coercion. And so they're currently in control of Mosul, which is the 2nd largest city of Iraq, as well as multiple oil fields, which we can see directly affects the economy and how much power ISIS has, since oil is such an important resource for this country. So because of this, there is like a new unity government that's being set up to attack ISIS and to restore power within the government. And so we can move on to the next slide. So this new government, they're currently trying to recruit new members, and they're focusing on Sunni and Kurdish deputy prime ministers. And they're also, Obama has like implemented U.S. airstrikes, and that has actually happened. And they have a specific dedication to a democratic future. And so what they're trying to do is to keep all of the ethnic and religious groups happy. And through this, they're specifically focusing on tolerance. So rather than trying to establish what's right and what's wrong, they're trying to accept differences between these groups because they know that it's not ever going to be as like equal as they would like it to be. And from a BBC News article, they said, while many key posts went to the majority Shia community, Sunnis and Kurds were also well represented, which is really important because this is actually what the Sunnis and the Kurds wanted. They wanted more representation. And then lastly, they're trying to implement a national plan. And so the whole point of this is to redistribute the authority to the provinces of Iraq. And so that's kind of what they're hoping will bring unity back to this country.
So I'll be covering some of the parliamentary elections, the political parties, and a little bit about ISIS, the terrorist group. So this is considered the first 40 elections in Iraq in 2005. And what happened before 2005 that would make this considered the first 3 elections?
They pushed Saddam Hussein out of power?
Exactly. After 2003, it was the fall of the Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party. In 2004, they established an interim government, which was just to see the transition to the next government. Can anybody, or I guess, do you have anything stand out there? Why would there be 2 elections in 2005? Okay, so after the January 2005 election, it was just to establish sort of another interim government, and they were just to oversee the Constitution of Iraq. In October of 2005, the Constitution of Iraq was ratified, so they had another election in December. Does anything else stand out? Okay. So from 2005 to 2010, you can see that basically all the parties are different. They've changed over the past 5 years. And that's because these parties or blocks consist of different smaller factions. And the United Iraqi Alliance, they broke apart around 2008, I believe, because their leader, Nouri al-Maliki, the rest of the factions didn't agree with how he was ruling. He was the prime minister at the time, how he was ruling the country. So Maliki took his own faction and he made the State of Law Coalition. In the Iraqi list that you see in the first one, after the January election, they added more groups and they became the Iraqi Nationalists right here. And they're sort of the Sunni party in Iraq. And then they gathered even more and they actually took, I think, the most seats in parliament in 2010. And they're led by Ayad Alawi. In the Kurdistan Alliance, or Kurdistan List as they're known, their successor is the Democratic Patriotic Alliance of Kurdistan. Okay, so this is the most recent election in April, I believe. As you can see, these are all Shia parties because there was sort of some tampering with the election, and sort of some of the terrorist groups like ISIS threatened to attack some of the Sunnis if they were to go and vote at the polls. And as you can see, none of them have the majority in parliament. So there's been discussion that these 3 Shia blocs and other ones will collaborate to make one enormous one and win the next election. Okay, so these are some of the major political parties. And what you guys really need to know is that there's 4 groups, so the Shias, the Sunnis, the secular bloc, and the Kurds. But this isn't really a direct representation as to who's in power because most of them are Shia, as we just saw. So the State of Law Coalition is the main Shia bloc. It was formed in 2010 after disputes between other Shia alliances. And they're led by outgoing Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Next is the Mujahideen bloc. It's the main Sunni bloc. It was formerly part of the Iraqi Nationalist bloc. And it's led by the former Speaker of Council of Representatives, Usami al-Mujah. Next is the National Coalition, and they're the main secular bloc, which means that they're basically a Sunni-led bloc, but they claim they have Shia party members too. They were founded in December 2012. They consist of 15 different groups. They split from the former Iraqi National Movement, and they're led by the former interim prime minister. He was there in 2004, Ayat al-Ali. And finally, the Kurdistan Democratic Bloc. It's the main Kurdish bloc. It was founded by Kurdish nationalist Mustafa Barzani, and is currently led by his son, Masoud Barzani, who's the president of the Iraqi Kurdistan region. Now we'll talk about ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State. The reason I put that at the end is because they changed their name 2 different times. Firstly, they were ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And then later they decided that they wanted to expand to the Levant, which consists of Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Cyprus, and part of southern Turkey. And just recently they just claimed that they wanted to be called the Islamic State. And if you've been paying attention in the news, when President Obama and his staff members discussed ISIS, they call them ISIL, as it would look bad on them if they were to talk about plane attacks, and they would have the word Syria in there, because that just doesn't bode well. They began as a militant group of Sunni extremists in 1999, and they were called Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad. In 2004, they allied with Osama bin Laden, and they became the Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq. On June 29th of this year, ISIS leader Bakr al-Baghdadi declared it has set up an Islamic State across parts of Iraq and Syria. ISIS follows an extreme anti-Western interpretation of Islam. They use jihadist violent force in regard to the opposition, opposing Muslims as non-believers. And jihad is just like it's a belief that they should get their point across by using violence, religious violence. Their main goal is to establish a Salafist Islamic State, which the Salafi movement is an idea that Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, said that his generation and the 2 generations after his are sort of the purest form of Islam. And so that's what ISIS is trying to replicate. And as Madison said earlier, their goal is to establish a caliphate, who is led by the caliph, who is considered the true successor of Muhammad. And they believe, the Sunnis believe that Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's advisor, was the first caliph. In 2006, ISIS claimed to have taken over 7 governorates of Iraq. Since its expansion into Syria, the group has claimed 16 different provinces across both. This year, ISIS created a new province called, crossing both Iraqi and Syrian borders, called Al-Farat. And currently, ISIS is in control of the governing body in Syria.
All right. There are many social problems that are happening right now inside Iraq that are notable. Probably first and foremost is the history of conflict between the Sunni and the Shia. Quick recent timeline. In 2003, the Sunni regime in power, which was fronted by Saddam Hussein, was toppled during the U.S. invasion. In 2006, Nuri al-Maliki was named Prime Minister of Iraq, and he was both a Shiite and supported by the U.S. government at this time. However, some of his critics blame a lot of this conflict that is happening right now on him, because instead of trying to mend a relationship between the Sunni and the Shia, he instead used the police to kill peaceful protesters and mass arrest Sunni citizens under anti-terrorist acts. Today, ISIS and Al-Qaeda compete for the influence of, 2011, U.S. leave Iraq and leave the Shiite government alone to support itself. The government is Shiite along with the National Army, and so the Sunnis rose up against them and have been rebelling, and the Shiite government has not handled this correctly. And today, ISIS and Al-Qaeda compete for influence over Islamist extremist groups in the area. ISIS is a divorced branch of Al-Qaeda. The split happened February of this last year. And ISIS holds this orange chunk of land here in between Iraq and Syria. And it's notable because those black little dots are markers of large oil fields in the area. And so they're using that as their primary form of funding. Like we said, they wanted to establish a caliphate, and fighters for the Sunni are, or fighters of ISIS are Sunni, and they use this as a very powerful recruitment tool. And this chunk of land is about the size of Belgium. They are trying to set up an autonomous Islamist country, caliphate across the two countries, and like we talked about before, their proponents would like to stretch the caliphate across the Levant, and that's where we get ISIS and ISIL. Let's see, the importance of oil, like I said, they're using that to raise war funds through exportation, so they drill it and sell it and raise money. And also they're trying to establish a power grid for the area, and they're drilling oil and selling it to the individuals of the land that they occupy, and use that as the basis of their governing body. And while they're establishing control, they're reaching out to other rebel groups, rebel group like JRTN, which is a Sunni nationalist group that is loyal to Hussein's old Ba'ath Party and their values. They're looking for a small Sunni dictatorship in Iraq. We're also looking at things that happen in Iraq, like in Karkash, which is a smaller Christian city, Christian predominant city of about 50,000 people. They have limited access to food and water. ISIS came in and basically had a mass conversion of the area, basically with a join or die type message to these citizens. What this conflict means to the Kurds. The Kurds are ethnically different than Iraqi Arabs. I'll get to that a little bit later. But they have their own semi-autonomous country in northern Iraq, that orange part on the map you can see. And they've been seen as something as a wild card in this conflict between the Iraqi government and ISIS. One important factor in this is they have about 80,000 to 240,000 Kurdish Peshmerga, which are militia soldiers that they are willing and able to use in this conflict. The Kurds themselves are mostly Sunni. Like I said, they're ethnically different from the Iraqi Arabs. The reason that they don't have their own country is because when Britain was drawing lines in the sand, their country just got blocked together, or their area, with Iraqi Arabs. And the Iraqi Arabs sort of dominated the Kurds earlier on, and so they've been oppressed throughout history. But importantly for them, they control these northern oil fields, and this is where a lot of conflict between them and ISIS comes in, is they both want to control these oil fields. However, the U.S. has pledged to expand a lot of support into Kurdistan. Already they've sent military advisors, and they're continuing air campaigns. And with this extended support, there's hope that the Kurds can help in leading an offensive against ISIS. What this means for Iraq. Professionals and journalists have come together, and they're looking about the future of Iraq over these next couple of years and seeing what this means for the civilians involved in this conflict. And they've pretty much decisively said that the people that are going to suffer the most are the Sunni and the minorities that live in Iraq. Right now, ISIS is basically contained to that little orange area. However, they're not just going to go out quietly. They'll continue to try to expand, and basically be like a cornered animal. So it's going to be more explosive over these next couple of years, I would say. Even though they have had a steady expansion rate, they have trouble getting down into the areas where their values aren't shared as many of the civilians. So they have a difficult time advancing. Baghdad, the capital, is a very Shia isolated city, and as long as ISIS can't control the capital, they will not be able to fully control the country. And the Kurds, like I said, are gaining a lot of strength and support. So this is going to become a larger conflict than it already is soon. Yep.
On the economy, the GDP growth rate of Iraq is at 4.2%, and out of 180 countries that were ranked, that puts them at number 72. So they're about in the top third of the countries ranked. By comparison, the U.S. GDP grew by 1.6%, and while that may sound like Iraq is running circles around us, with our GDP being so massive, it's hard to grow by the numbers like Iraq is putting up. It's a state-run economy, meaning that the government really overshadows everything that goes on within its borders. Their unemployment is currently at 16%, which is pretty bad worldwide. It puts them at 143 out of 180, and a quarter of their population is below the poverty line. Oh, could you go back for a second?
Yeah, sorry.
The GDP is broken up by different sectors. The oil sector represents the largest by far, with 55% of their GDP, and everything else just takes the back burner to that. So with their massive unemployment and a quarter of the population below the poverty line, the money from that oil isn't seen by most of the people in the country. It's just funneled to a select group. And it wouldn't be Iraq without talking about the oil, because everybody loves oil, including George W. Bush. It accounts for 90% of their government revenue. That's really what drives their country. And in 2012, they reached a 30-year high. And the high oil prices worldwide, as I'm sure all of you know at the gas pumps, increased the government revenue is through the roof in Iraq. And it's expected to keep increasing. In the next 2 years, it's projected to double. But their infrastructure is getting kind of outdated. They're going to need to upgrade it to reach their full potential. Here's a graph showing their oil production, and it's really interesting to see. In 1980, the Iran-Iraq war was going on, and what happened was both countries were kind of haphazardly launching missiles at each other, kind of targeting the oil wells. And also Iran used mines, attack helicopters, gunboats to target Iraqi oil tankers to drive down their production. And as the war was winding down and came to an end in '88, you can see their production skyrocket again. But then Iraq decides to invade Kuwait, and interestingly, the UN Security Council, can anybody tell me who sits on that? US, yep.
The UK?
Yep.
Russia, France, China.
Yep, very good.
You want candy for all that?
Okay.
Okay. So the UN Security Council puts near total trade embargo and financial sanctions against Iraq. So they weren't able to export a lot of their oil, which crippled their economy. Because of that, the Iraqi people started suffering because they couldn't get the food, medicine, or humanitarian resources that they need. So the UN decides to institute the Oil for Food program in Iraq. What that was is they said the government could sell X amount of oil, and they could keep the revenue from that, but a certain percentage of it, I believe around 2/3, had to be spent on food and medicine and other humanitarian resources for the country. So the war rages on, comes to an end, and then the U.S. goes into Iraq in 2003 in the war for oil, more or less, and it affects production again. Now, the investment culture of a country is always interesting to look at. There has been a decrease in fighting, which is translated into an increase in economic activity. And of course, that's all comparative, because there's still a ton of fighting and not a whole lot of economic activity. But foreign investors have started investing in the energy, construction, and retail sector. And the foreign confidence rating I found pretty interesting. The numbers was 12 to 18%, which puts it at fourth class worldwide behind Somalia, which is a pretty trustworthy country, in my opinion. By comparison, the U.S. is in the top 20 worldwide, between 69 and 80%. I thought this gentleman was interesting. He kind of reminded me of an Iraqi Bernie Madoff, just with his stacks of cash, for what it's worth. The economy in Iraq is facing a number of issues. The first of which is the overshadowing government. Does anybody know what other country we had studied that had an overshadowing government in the past? Yeah. Yeah, very good. Japan, Inc. Oh, sorry. Also, their unproportional oil sector is helping fuel a conflict in Kurdistan, where the Kurdish government passed a law saying that they can export the oil that they collect, but the Iraqi government is saying that they can't because they want to keep their prices that high. The business environment in Iraq is pretty unfavorable between all the security issues and the uncertainty politically. So it's not really the place that you would want to open up a mom and pop business. They also have the unemployment and the skilled labor shortage, which doesn't really help them. To combat this, the government instituted a 5-year plan. Their main idea behind it is to further expand beyond oil. And as the world moves to more progressive energies like wind and solar, if Iraq doesn't change, it could cripple their economy and their GDP. Also, they want to further develop the industrial sector, which could help with their unemployment and skilled labor. But of course, there's a number of issues with this plan, the first of which is way overly ambitious. It probably won't happen, partly because of all the violence between the warring factions and just the political fighting going on in Iraq.
Okay, so next we're talking about international relations. The first country that I focused on that had the most relation with Iraq would be Kuwait. In 1990, Iraq actually occupied Kuwait, and this was not the first time that Iraq tried to occupy Kuwait. There were numerous other times, but this eventually led to the Persian Gulf War. Now, can anybody tell me what the operation was called when the U.S. actually led air strikes into this war? Anybody? It's a movie, if that helps. It was Operation Desert Storm. So the reasons that Iraq actually went to war with Kuwait was because what Iraq really wanted was that Kuwait would forgive the debt that Kuwait actually participated with Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. They wanted compensation for oil produced in disputed oil fields, and they really would like Kuwait as a territory because Kuwait has a lot of the oil fields. Resolution 687 actually ended the war. It was formed by the UN and this established a ceasefire. Today the two countries are working to resolve the UN Chapter 7 disputes, and these resolutions have contributed to the Iraq War of 2003. So another country that I focused on was Turkey. Two main documents that actually are very important with these two countries. One of them is Treaty of Sadabad. This treaty actually helped with border disputes as well as independence, and it is not allowed for Iraq and Turkey to give Kurdish rebels on Turkish territory help. The Baghdad Pact of 1955 was between Britain, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. This helped with regional defense and preventing Soviet Union infiltration in the Middle East. Now, unfortunately, that Iraq has actually had problems with Kurds in the past because what the Kurds want is really to have independence and autonomy, especially from Turkey. The Kurdistan Regional Government which we can actually see up here in the most orange, is part of the northern Iraq region. This is like the ruling body of that part of Iraq. Now, unfortunately, there is a terrorist group led by the Kurds. It is called the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party. This is a rebel terrorist group, and it has launched attacks from Iraq into Turkey. And unfortunately, this has actually hindered some of the relations between Iraq and Turkey, because obviously if the Kurds are sending bombs to Turkey, it's going to affect their economy as well as tourism. And now, however, on April 25th, 2014, there are plans to withdraw from Turkey and northern Iraq. The most important country that we're going to focus on is Iran, and one of the most important agreements that they had with Iran was the 1975 Algiers Agreement. This basically settled border disputes, and it helped end the Kurdish rebellion. Now, these border disputes were between the Shah al-Arab and Khuzestan. However, Iraq and Iran did not come to an agreement so easily. They still clashed over the Shah al-Arab waterway, and unfortunately, these border disputes, as well as Sunni-Shia relations, where actually Khomeini of Iran, which was one of the key players in the Iraq-Iran war, he wanted to inspire insurgency among the oppressed Shias. However, Saddam Hussein, who is a Sunni, did not want that, and he and him clashed, and that is another reason why Iraq and Iran went to war. Iraq also wanted to become a dominant Persian Gulf state. Now, unfortunately, Iraq is very landlocked, and they wanted more availability to the Gulf of it. Now, can anyone tell me what another country is that we've talked about that is landlocked? Yeah.
France?
Yep. So, leading to the Iraq-Iran War, Iraq actually attacked Iran on September 22nd, 1980. This war, however, ended with a ceasefire agreement in August 1988. Today, Iraq is actually one of the top 5 trading partners of Iran, and there are agreements on land and river borders, as well as Iran is cooperating with the U.S. to help with the ISIS crisis that is in Iraq. So a picture that I actually found that was just really interesting is this is showing the Iraq-Iran war and where actually the Iraq chemical attacks were and the advances that both countries made in the war. So the U.S. and Iraq have also had relations. So Operation Iraqi Freedom was in 2003. This was basically the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. And this happened because they wanted to disarm weapons of mass destruction and Saddam Hussein's support for terrorism and free the Iraqi people. However, U.S. troops did leave in 2011, and they actually did form the Strategic Framework Agreement with Iraq, and this was to provide basis for U.S. bilateral relations. Now, unfortunately, the U.S. has had to intervene in the past, which was called the 2014 American Intervention. It began in the summer of 2014, and it was in order to stop the gains and invasion of ISIS. Now, this was also for the U.S. advantage as well, because they wanted to protect their assets as well as advise the Iraqi government. On September 10, 2014, President Obama said that he was going to increase airstrikes in the area. Approximately 1,261 civilian deaths have occurred only in September, which is a lot, but the U.S. is providing humanitarian relief. Okay, so if you guys can just go on this link, it's really interesting. It's just showing where a lot of the refugees have gone, what countries, and how many refugees in Iraq there actually are. But a graph that I found that was really interesting was that it shows the Iraqi civilian deaths since 2003, and as you can see, there was an upsurge in 2003 because of obviously Operation Iraqi Freedom, and in 2014 there was also a rise because of the U.S.-led invasion.
Thank you.
Good work.